I'm going to call on our fellow commissioner, Ms. Carol King, to come and make a couple of announcements. And I just want to acknowledge that we have some of our other commissioners who are seating throughout the audience, and we just want to welcome them here also this afternoon, and want to welcome all of you here. And I hope you enjoy yourselves. Ms. Carol King.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. This is ongoing Historic Preservation Commission business. March the 1st is the deadline for applications for historic signs. We do it twice a year. This will be the first one for 2023. I'll leave some brochures back at the reception desk back there. We also have blasted those of you who live in historic neighborhoods, hopefully have gotten it through your neighborhood associations. So it will take you to the links on the city website about how important it is to get a sign for your house, as well as the process that you need to go through, and then get it back to Paula up at Land Use before March the 1st for the HPC to consider getting you a historic sign for your house. Another point of old business is that Landmarks Foundation will be working with the Historic Preservation Commission to fulfill the Certified Local Government Grant given to the City of Montgomery from the National Association of Preservation Commissions to establish some continuing education seminars for the boards and for the public here about our historic architecture that we have here in Montgomery. So we'll be working with the city on that, and that will be coming up soon, as well as our preservation leadership seminar, which will be held in May too. So just look for your city website and for your neighborhood association blasts that come out to you. Thank you, Dr. Bailey.
Thank you too. And now it's time to introduce our coordinator for this afternoon, Ms. Lois Cortell. Lois Cortell is Senior Development Manager for the City of Montgomery's Department of Community Development. She leads the Development Division. Lois has nearly 30 years of experience advancing urban planning, community livability, and economic development projects throughout the country. She's been here in Montgomery for 10 years now and started working on the Western Railway property along with then Director Mac McLeod back in 2014. Together with Christy Anderson and Jocelyn Zanzat, thank you to the city staff who are trying to call attention to the rich history of this important, fascinating property on the north side of downtown. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Lois Cortell.
Wow, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. And welcome to, we have two new Historic Preservation Commission members, and it's just a pleasure to be here for today. You have such an important job. Historic Preservation Commission members, Architecture Review Board, you do not always get a lot of love, but in my mind, you are the front lines of preservation. So thank you. I work in economic I work in economic development. So I talk about assets, right? Assets, building assets, cities competing against other cities. So what's Montgomery's advantage? Well, Montgomery's history is an economic asset. Buildings that reflect history are a critical part of keeping that asset vital. And when we lose the physical memory of something, we often lose the entire memory of it. These are non-renewable assets, so they're vulnerable. And that's why I care from an economic development standpoint about this important property. And that's why I say you guys are the front lines. So thank you, all of you. Which brings me to the historic property that is today's fun meeting topic. We promised Dr. Bailey that we were gonna have the biggest Historic Preservation Commission meeting in a long time. So let's talk railroads. Did any of you enjoy the railroad music that Mike Mann back there was playing before the meeting? Well, we're just trying to get you all on track. Sorry, we're trying to have fun here. Okay, so I just have a few introductory remarks. Yeah, thank you. That was a delayed laugh there, Andrew, but thank you. Just a few introductory remarks and some recognitions. So just 3 blocks north of downtown Montgomery is what is left of the Western Railway of Alabama shops, and it sits waiting for its next phase of life. It is a place where across almost 140 years, something like 700 skilled laborers could and usually did make everything the railroad needed from scratch. The Western Railway of Alabama shops served as a major railroad repair site for itself and for several other railroads. It spawned countless stories. Its rails sent volunteers for military service in wartime, and it paid wages that fed Montgomery families. It was the largest railroad shop in the region for many years and was a crucial component of Montgomery's role in transportation history. In 1998, the property was listed as a historic district on the Alabama Register of Landmarks and Heritage, and this listing came after extensive documentation and records that are now with the U.S. Library of Congress. It is significant because of its architectural character, grouping, scale, and historic context in the United States transportation history. So the City of Montgomery commissioned this project, and I'm going to call it a Historic Information and Public Education Project, way back in this part of it in 2019. And we worked with the University of Alabama, Office of Archaeological Research, or the OAR. Did you all know that they had an Office of Archaeological Research? This guy's smart up here. Well, they do. Thank you to the Landmarks Foundation. Carol's here. They introduced us to the Office of Archaeological Research team. And the OAR team is headed up by Jeremiah Stegler, who's here with his family tonight. He developed the 3-dimensional model and video that you're going to see, including narration about the property and each of its buildings. He has recently even traveled to Paris for something similar, another 3D modeling project related to post-fire rebuilding of the Notre Dame Cathedral. Pretty impressive, those, Jeremiah. And also thank you to city staff involved, not only land use and the PR team. On the city project team, we had Christy Anderson. Yes, I'm still counting you, city. Christy Anderson back there, Jocelyn Zanzo, and Desmond Wilson is here, the department director, who's been the constant champion of this project. Thank you also to Bishop Andrew Waldo, who is here in the front row over there. He was a great source of information. He collected many oral interviews and photos with employees and families, and provided original source material for the film you're going to see. The city's intention in this project is to provide an interpretive tool for the public using these earliest maps of the site and 2-scale drawings, historic photographs, and recorded interviews. So this type of modeling, the use of it in its application for historic preservation, for historic appreciation, we think is worthy of further discussion for many other sites. Almost done. When we started, this was never just about the buildings. It's never just about the buildings. It's been very important to this whole team that this is not just about a physical property, the workers, the employees, their families, and not just their work. There's a lot of work. Rail yard work was hard work, but also the fun they had. They played baseball. There was a company band. And yes, they had a pet alligator named Roy Dickerson who lived on the site. So Reverend Waldo and Jeremiah Stegler, they understood the assignment. They understood it and they ran with it. And they're here, and I want them to stand. And I want to just really quickly recognize them both briefly with a certificate of appreciation that Jocelyn's going to give, and a commemorative poster from tonight's premiere. The certificate, she's got blue folders for you too. On the occasion of the February 14th, 2023 meeting of the Historic Preservation Commission, on behalf of the city, we would like to thank you for amazing work on the Western Railway of Alabama, Montgomery Shop's digital model and documentary film. You have contributed greatly to the enrichment of understanding of an important era in Montgomery history, its rail yard history, and in the working lives of many Montgomery families. Thank you, guys. They're both going to be here afterwards for questions if we have some time for formal questions or informal conversations. And so now, without further ado, if you want popcorn or water, now's your time to get it. We're going to lower the lights, and I present to you the Western Railway of Alabama.
This is a story about Montgomery, Alabama, a railroad story. Walking through downtown Montgomery, the influence of railroads is immediately visible. From Union Station on the riverfront, through which millions of travelers passed on countless journeys for more than a century, to the only remaining freight station out of 7 originally here. Railroads made livelihoods, hopes, and dreams possible. At its peak, Montgomery hosted 6 railroads: the Atlantic Coastline, the Central of Georgia, the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio, the Louisville and Nashville, the Seaboard Airline, and the West Point route, with its partner railroads, the Western Railway of Alabama and the Atlanta and West Point Railroad. Downtown, freight moved between shippers and receivers. People arrived and departed on journeys of possibility and pleasure throughout the Southeast and to every corner of the nation. All of this was made possible by the men and women who took care of the trains, the locomotives, the coaches, sleepers and lounges, the freight cars, and the tracks themselves. At the peak of railroad passenger travel in the 1920s, large workforces staffed roundhouses and repair shops to keep the steam locomotives maintained and ready to run. They repaired, cleaned, and stocked passenger cars. They assembled freight trains for efficient delivery of important goods. This all happened on the edges of downtown Montgomery. The largest of these shops complexes was the Western Railway of Alabama car and engine shops, employing as many as 700 workers during its heyday from the 1910s to the mid-1950s. First appearing on the west side of North Court Street in the 1850s, this maintenance facility began its life serving the Western Railway of Alabama's predecessor railroads, the Montgomery Railroad, the Montgomery and West Point Railroad, and the Western Railroad of Alabama, moving to the east side of North Court after the Civil War. Skilled tradesmen worked in the various shops, including the carpenter shop, machine shop, air and brake shop, wheel and axle shop, planing and pattern shop, upholstery shop, car repair shop, blacksmith shop, paint shop, laboratory, roundhouse, and boiler shop, among other roles. However, throughout the Western Railway of Alabama and its predecessor's history, all of this work was undertaken under the strict rules of slavery prior to the Civil War and Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction. Only in the very last few years of its history, from 1965 to 1971, were these rules eliminated. This meant that workers termed skilled could only be white, and that African American employees were helpers or laborers. The shop's roundhouse records from the 1890s bear witness to the substantial differences in pay based on this caste system. A former carman, that is an employee trained to repair passenger and freight cars, reported that at the height of Jim Crow, who could do what was strictly regulated. For example, helpers in the car shops, even one with 30 years' experience in car repair, were not allowed to make the final tightening of a bolt or driving of a rivet in a repair, but a white apprentice with only months of experience was allowed to accomplish this task. Section gangs were teams of workers who maintained track at the shops and up and down the main line. They consisted of a white foreman and a team of African American track laborers who did the heavy work of replacing ties and rails and maintaining the roadway ballast. Railroad jobs, including shop jobs, were still some of the best jobs available to African Americans during Jim Crow. Union pay scales and pension plans made these coveted positions. With the Civil Rights Act of 1965, however, all positions could be held. An African American section gang laborer with many years' experience, named Henry Caffey, would, for example, become roadmaster in the late 1960s. He was in charge of all the West Point route track from Selma to Atlanta. This story is about the men and women who worked in the shops themselves, about the work they did, the service they rendered, and kinds of facilities they needed for this work. It's a story we share now in celebration of the contributions these workers made to Montgomery and the state of Alabama, and of the fragments of the site that remain in existence to this day. The Western Railway of Alabama car and engine shops were the heart and soul of the company. Employees here kept the railroad ready to run. They repaired wrecked and worn-out passenger and freight cars, built and upholstered furniture for the passenger cars, and overhauled locomotives. The Western of Alabama shops not only maintained the company's own locomotives and rolling stock, but also performed these services for other railroads, such as the Birmingham and Southeastern and the Tuskegee Railroads. In 1899, the shops had reached a joint use agreement with the larger Central of Georgia Railroad. These shops were lean and efficient. They were reputed to have the highest, most up-to-date standards in the early 20th century. The Western Railway of Alabama was first chartered as the Montgomery Railroad in 1832, making it among the first in the nation, though by 1841 only 32 miles of tracks had been laid. The initiative to build this railroad was led by Abner McGehee and a group of ambitious investors. This included many of Montgomery's most prominent early citizens. Originating in Montgomery, the railway would run northeast to Atlanta. Enslaved Africans would create the grade and lay the track. Construction of the railroad was completed to West Point, Georgia in the spring of 1851, where it was met by the Atlanta and LaGrange Railroad 3 years later. The line only reached Selma during Reconstruction in 1870, operating now as the Western Railroad of Alabama. In 1883, this railroad was given a new name, the Western Railway of Alabama, and it was given a new charter. Now, jointly managed with the Atlanta and West Point and Georgia railroads, the shops became a maintenance and repair hub for what became known as the West Point route. The Civil War had been harsh on the railroad. 1/3 of travel on the railroad was the transportation of troops at half the normal rate. Material shortages made maintenance nearly impossible. The original shops were burned and the surrounding rails destroyed near the close of the war in 1865 by General James H. Wilson and his troops during his famous raid through Alabama. The shops had been a primary target for destruction. The railroad struggled throughout Reconstruction, and the shops had to work with old equipment until 1897. That year, fire had partially destroyed the roundhouse and the machine shops on the west side of North Court, where Sable Steel is today, damaging 10 locomotives. Most of the damage was covered by insurance, and these funds, along with new investment money, spurred on a massive rebuilding effort. Many new buildings were built or repaired and expanded. A great deal of new equipment was purchased. The capability of the shops expanded and increased in quality. Freight cars were built from scratch. Passenger cars were beautifully furnished, and locomotives were maintained. Some rolling stock required only maintenance or small repairs. The locomotives and cars were sometimes disassembled and rebuilt with new parts and new efficiencies. Most of these parts were made here from molten iron and steel in the forges of the blacksmith shop and fashioned on the heavy equipment in the machine shop and planing mill. These machines were powered by a belt system that can still be seen in the corners of the planing mill ceiling. The new buildings were pivotal in expanding operations. Almost all rolling stock owned by the West Point route was built, rebuilt, or repaired in the Montgomery shops. The steam engine was a marvel of engineering, and maintaining and running them was a dirty business. Countless moving parts required precision work, and each building housed specific operations. Many of the buildings became stained by smoke and coal dust. The smell of hot iron and burned coal pervaded the workplace. However, at certain times of the day, there were the hunger-inducing fragrances of meat and 3 lunches brought from home and reheated on the shop radiators. Under the 400-foot-long steel roof of the car shed, employees finished building or repaired passenger and freight cars. Between 300 and 400 boxcars were built here from the ground up. The wheel trucks and framing would be constructed elsewhere in the shops and then brought in the shed and attached to the car frame. Carmen riveted the steel plates to the exterior of the cars and installed the internal woodworking. The wheel pit created a space underneath cars for carmen to remove individual wheels or axles or work on the trucks. Railcar wheels, even today, need to be frequently inspected and replaced. For example, when hairline cracks appear or when emergency braking creates flat spots on the wheels. From time to time, passenger cars would need to have a wheel changed with passengers still in it, as this process did not take long. Steel scaffolds lined the outside tracks, while a hanging wooden scaffold lined the inner tracks. Wrecking trains extracted and transported damaged cars to the southwest corner of the shed for repair. On the northwest corner of the shed, a 62-foot brick building housed a battery and car lighting shop. Railcar batteries, especially for passenger cars, were charged here, and job equipment not in use would be stored here. Once the construction was finished, a switcher, or yard mule, moved the car further south into the brick paint shop. One of the first brick buildings completed during the rebuilding of the shops was the paint shop in 1900. In contrast to the neighboring planing mill, this building was framed with wood instead of steel. The floor was concrete with vitrified brick between the tracks. Most industrial architecture was plain and utilitarian, but the Montgomery shops were built with some aesthetic beauty in the brickwork. There is a nearly 8-foot wide circular window near the apex of the southern wall, and the tall windows lining the building's sides were topped with brick arches. This building was where passenger cars, baggage cars, and coaches were painted before being put into operation. This required the shop to be very clean to ensure a quality look to the car after so much work had gone into them by other departments. The main entrance was on the east wall, near the southeast corner, rather than the center of the south wall. This positioned the employee next to the paint mixing room, office, and showers on the southern end of the building. Cut glass was also stored here for replacing windows in the cars. Stencils were handed out of the offices through a service window when they were needed. Prior to painting, the cars were carefully sanded. When painting was taking place, and while it was drying, most of the windows and doors were closed to ensure a consistent surface. While lighting was good in the building, the ventilation was not, and potentially hazardous fumes tended to build up in this building. The painting operations took place on a system of sliding adjustable scaffolds. There were fewer pneumatic power tools here than in some of the other shops, but welding and cutting must have been a frequent operation, as there were 8 oxyacetylene torch stations along the walls. Until the coming of diesel locomotives on the Western Railway of Alabama, a change the West Point route completed across the system by July 1954. The south end of the paint shop also contained a small laboratory for testing scale prevention additives that were added to the water in the steam engines. The planing mill, just east of the paint shop, housed the woodworking operations of the shops. On the first floor, carpenters formed the large wooden structural pieces for the cars, and coach furniture parts were roughed out. This area of the planing mill also produced highly precise wooden forms, or patterns, which the nearby foundry would use to forge locomotive wheels, drawbars, smokestacks, smokebox doors, and so forth. Many large machine tools occupied this space, such as planers, bandsaws, milling machines, and joiners. A large steel lift in the northwest corner of the building lifted furniture parts sent to the second floor for finishing. Next to the lift, space was provided for workers to cut and stitch the large belts required to operate machinery throughout the shops. The operations on the second floor were divided into 3 parts. The upholstery shop fitted furniture with fabric and cushions in an area near the lift itself. Many racks beyond the upholstery shop to the south stored the wooden patterns created in the first floor below. Skilled carpenters built cabinet and interior parts for passenger cars. This was also where finer woods, such as cocobolo and poplar, were stored. There was even a shop in this area that produced beautiful stained glass work for passenger car transoms above the windows and in the car clerestories. Just to the north of the planing mill, and sharing a connecting wall, was the wheel and axle shop. As the name implies, this is where the surface profiles of rolling stock wheels were machined to precise specifications and pressed onto the axles. Wheels needed to be quickly installed into the wheel trucks without having to waste time reshaping or adjusting. During the steam era, locomotive driving wheels had what were known as tires. These tires were steel rings heated to expand the inner diameter and then pressed onto the cast iron wheel. This process enabled crews to change a worn or damaged tire without having to replace the entire wheel. A brass foundry on the eastern wall of the building created brass bushings and other forged brass parts needed throughout the shops. A small metal shed nearby contained the wheel and axle shop's mobile fire extinguisher. This was simply a fire hose rolled up on a 2-wheeled spool with a forward-facing push handle for 2 men to move the hose wherever it was needed. The shop's complex contained several such sheds distributed around the property. The hydrants were fed by water contained in the tall steel standpipe on the eastern edge of the site. Repairs and maintenance to the railroad rolling stock required a wide array of jobs performed at the blacksmith shop. This shop, completed in 1898, was 83 feet long and 38 feet wide, and constructed of brick and clerestory ventilation. This is a natural type of ventilation in hot climates where cooler air comes through windows on the ground floor and hot air rises through vents in the roof. This same system was used on coaches. In the shop, skilled tradesmen forged tools, made roughed-out dies to be completed in the machine shop, and constructed larger parts such as couplers, truck sides, and bolsters. This would have been a blisteringly hot job. The blacksmith shop was the only building with an earthen floor. All others either had brick or concrete flooring. Sometimes, newly forged iron parts were dropped onto the dirt to quickly cool and harden them. The softer earthen floor helped to prevent damage to not yet fully hardened iron. In the mid-1920s, machines were purchased for the shop to help with steel spring production. In the late 1920s, a huge 12-inch piston steam hammer was purchased that was said to have shaken the ground of the entire complex when it was used. Completed in 1902, The Western Railway of Alabama's 20-stall roundhouse was built to replace a smaller 16-stall roundhouse that occupied what is now the Sable Steel scrapyard on North Court Street. It housed steam locomotives while they were inactive, under repair, or receiving regular maintenance prior to a scheduled run. A new 80-foot turntable was installed in 1903 to replace a smaller one that had been plagued by construction flaws. The new turntable was powered by a Weir and Craig pressurized air motor. The floor of the roundhouse was made of vitrified brick, and many of the stalls had drop pits for working under an engine. During the 1920s, as steam locomotives grew in size, the company once again replaced the turntable, installing a 100-foot turntable that lasted some years beyond the end of the steam operations in 1954, proving its continued usefulness in turning even diesel locomotives around for correct positioning at the front of a train. A tender shop extended about 110 feet from one of the stalls on the north side of the roundhouse. A tender, or coal car, was attached to a steam engine by means of a more permanent drawbar instead of a coupler, and provided both water and fuel to power the locomotive. The tender shop made both heavy and light repairs to these tenders. In 1921, management added a new office and segregated locker and washrooms to the south side of the roundhouse. A short walk to the south was a small brick building that housed the toilets. By 1962, the roundhouse had been dismantled, and all that remained were the brick and concrete foundations. However, the turntable continued to operate. The shops required a substantial water supply for fueling steam trains, which was kept in an underground reservoir and a massive 15-foot wide and 120-foot tall steel standpipe. Water was supplied by a company-owned pump, but could be connected to the city water supply in case of a fire. For an example of how much water was required at the shops, the tender attached to locomotive number 378, a 282 Mikado type freight locomotive, could hold up to 10,000 gallons of water. At the height of steam operations, the West Point Routes fleet included locomotives with tender capacities ranging from 3,000 to 11,000 gallons, depending on the size and purpose of the locomotive. The largest and last two steam locomotives purchased by the West Point route in 1944 had tenders with an 18,000-gallon water capacity. The standpipe's capacity was 158,619 gallons of water, enough to keep these locomotives well supplied. The roundhouse was built to house up to 20 locomotives and their tenders, so the need for water was high. Built in 1913 by the Roberts and Schaefer Company of Chicago, the 600-ton capacity coaling tower, or coal chute, was newer than most of the complex's brick buildings and is one of the few surviving structures. The 39-foot by 34-foot structural concrete frame of the tower rises 60 feet above the surrounding ground. It replaced a smaller wooden chute built in 1902. This was dirty work. Operators filled measured hoppers for loading correct amounts of fresh coal into locomotive tenders. The men who worked in this area of the shops also operated the shop mule. This was a small steam crane on rail trucks used to remove coal cinders from the nearby cinder pit by loading them into an open hopper car for disposal elsewhere. Water columns used for filling the water tanks of locomotive tenders were placed on the southeast and northwest corners of the coaling tower. Maintenance of way tracks were just west of the coaling tower. Tracks just to the east provided a location where older wooden boxcars were partially torn down in preparation for rebuilding with steel plate siding. This was a strenuous job that would be, at times, used to discipline young workers and apprentices. Between the roundhouse and the freight car repair shed was a 2-story concrete storage and locker room that remains on the site today. The first floor was filled with small parts bins. On the upper floor were lockers, showers, and large, round hand-washing fountains. To the south of the building was an expansive concrete platform covered with a gable-type roof extending from the storeroom to the acetylene house. A wrought iron fence 6 feet high enclosed the entire platform on both sides. The platform provided storage for both freight and passenger car parts, such as metal pilots and footboards, and for steam locomotives there were couplers, draft gears, yokes, springs, brake cylinders, reservoirs, valves, etc. There was also a rack for storing 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of metal used to repair the cars. The Western Railway of Alabama had a close partnership with the Atlanta and West Point Railroad and the Georgia Railroad. These three were considered short-line railroads, but which also carried important mainline trains, such as the New York to New Orleans Crescent and Piedmont Limited. Being a small railroad, everyone who worked for the West Point route knew each other, and the associated companies created social activities, competitive sports, and even marching bands at the Montgomery, Atlanta, and Augusta shops. The shops employed hundreds of workers, whose spouses and children participated in the company's social activities. The company magazine, The Courier, reported on new buildings, steam engine, and passenger rebuilds. At times it also reported on the quality work of various employees from all three railroads. It even extended into the social and civic lives of the employees. For example, it described the shop's baseball team games play-by-play. It discussed competitions in which the shop's marching band participated and often won. It reported on new fashions for women, precocious children of employees, and even showcased homes of various workers. It also notified employees when a coworker died and when a new child arrived in a family. Many companies during the 1920s developed similar company magazines to encourage a sense of community and increase loyalty and productivity. They also served as a response to increasing labor activism. Prior to the renaissance of the shops, a series of strikes in 1894 had crippled railroads throughout the country. Labor disputes had brought both conflict within the company and often resulted in new benefits for employees. However, such problems were not front and center at the Montgomery shops until the Great Strike of July 1, 1922. The strike was instigated by a drastic 13% pay reduction instituted by the Railroad Labor Board on May 28, 1922. The board was established in 1920 after the close of World War I to oversee wages and working conditions for railroad workers. The railroad companies had requested the reduction, but the Labor Board took the brunt of the blame. Railroad Labor Board Chairman Ben W. Hooper, who had been appointed by President Warren Harding, compared mediating the dispute to pacifying a den of lions and tigers with bare hands, while he was only armed with gentle, unenforceable admonitions. At the peak of the strike, all members of the Federated Shopcrafts Union, which included all the skilled white labor, walked out. In the end, the strike forced several important concessions from the railroad companies, including a guaranteed 8-hour workday, overtime, holiday vacations, an order of seniority, and fixed pay rates. On a lighter side, the Courier included a gossip column and teasing anecdotes about one employee or another. Sometimes the stories were extraordinary. One of the notable residents at the shops was known as Roy Dickerson. He was an alligator that had wandered onto the property, perhaps after one of the Alabama River floods. Montgomery shop's employees housed him in a concrete pond, building an iron fence to keep him from causing trouble. In winter, when Roy Dickerson got too cold, employees would carry him like pallbearers into the planing mill and put him next to a radiator. As soon as he started waking up, they would rush him back out to the pond. The fence, however, was ultimately not enough to hold him, and he became known as an escape artist. On several occasions, the shops got a visit from the city police, telling them that Roy was scaring people downtown, and eventually, they told the shop's manager they had to get rid of him. The manager convinced the mayor to build him a pond in Oak Park, where the Montgomery Zoo was in its infancy. The enclosure was eventually home to several alligators and was popular with the local children. Roy Dickerson is said to have survived there into the 1960s. The western of Alabama shops weathered the interwar period in the 1920s and early 1930s surprisingly well despite the Great Depression and the increased cost of labor. However, the late 30s were more difficult with continued nationwide labor struggles and the diversification of transportation methods. Increasing competition from trucking companies and air freight coincided with lower agricultural shipping. World War II brought a brief but dramatic increase in freight and passenger traffic in support of the war effort, resulting in record profits. After the war, increased competition, lower demand, and more labor disputes led to a steady decline for the West Point route and its Montgomery shops. The Western Railway of Alabama entered the diesel era slowly, purchasing its first 4 diesel switchers from the Baldwin Company in 1944. Liking what it saw, the company purchased its first road diesel from the Electromotive Diesel Company in 1948. Its success in performance and cost reductions brought a flood of new orders, bringing the steam era to an end in July 1954. As new freight and passenger diesels came online, the company built the diesel shop, located between the blacksmith shop and the air compressor shop. In 1961, the shop substantially expanded the size and heavy maintenance capacity of the old machine shop and moved diesel maintenance into this updated facility. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, passenger traffic on the railroads faced dramatic challenges with the advent of automobiles and airline traffic. The need for increased efficiency and the shift toward freight traffic meant fewer jobs at the shops and ultimately a removal of all maintenance operations. In 1971, the shops closed and all operations shifted to Atlanta, ending an important era in Montgomery railroading. In the 1920s, there were well over 150 Class I railroads. By 1971, that number had been cut in half, and by the mid-1990s, there were only a handful of mega railroads. The Western Railway of Alabama, the Atlanta West Point Railroad, and the Georgia Railroad had merged with 3 other Montgomery rails. These were the Seaboard Airline, the Atlantic Coast Line, and the Louisville and Nashville Railroads. Together they became the Seaboard System Railroad in 1983, later being absorbed into CSX Transportation. Montgomery has been an important railroad center now for almost 200 years. The Western Railway of Alabama was there at the beginning, under its previous name, the Montgomery Railroad. It struggled to bring a brand new technology to Alabama in 1832, but engines have run through this city ever since the first engine started down the tracks in 1841.
We'd be happy to answer any questions about the history, and Jeremiah, about the film, and whatever you. We'll try to answer anything.
I spoke to One Montgomery this morning. I know we have some folks from One Montgomery, and there was a question that came up: why Montgomery? Why wasn't there a bigger railroad at Birmingham? Can you explain that?
The best way to put it is that in the development of railroads, they were as the film pointed out, there were hundreds of them at one point, and across the nation they tended to be small and gradually would be merged. The railroad, the one railroad that connected Birmingham and Montgomery was the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which had a shop here, but it was a smaller shop, and its big shop, not quite as big as the Western of Alabama shop here, but its biggest shop was up in Albany, up near Decatur, Alabama, just below the Tennessee line. It was just, this is where it happened in Montgomery. The Atlantic coastline, which was here, had a decent sized shop, but they didn't do quite as much as the Western of Alabama did. They didn't have all the crafts, you know, because at the shops here, they had forges for making pieces of metal, and as the movie showed, upholstery, stained glass. They did all of it here, and I think it just developed that way, as a way to service that line through from ultimately from Selma to Atlanta. There was a Western of Alabama shop in Atlanta, but the big heavy repairs were done here first, and then later when it moved to Atlanta. There was a fairly big shop in Augusta for the Georgia Railroad as well.
Might be able to shed a little light on it also. When the shop started in the 1830s, Birmingham was not even really around.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe, with as big as a city as Birmingham is now, that it didn't really start growing until the late 19th century with the introduction of steel production that was so pivotal to its growth.
The Mobile, go ahead. Yes, Marion. In annual reports, where did all the design work come for the buildings on the shops, in the shops complex? I mean, for example, the Coaling Tower, which the movie mentions, was built by Robertson Schaefer Company and designed and built by Robertson Schaefer Company of Chicago. Some of the roundhouse buildings were designed. I have some blueprints for when they added on the locker rooms and what there, but the annual reports for the company list the architects each time and the construction companies. You can get at those, but we didn't, that wasn't a point. I'm sorry? Well, I think it developed with the needs of the railroad. I mean, when they need it, is it cheaper to make it ourselves or is it cheaper to outsource it? And in those days, it was cheaper to do it yourself. So they would build the different buildings as the railroad grew and needed the different facilities. Anything you want to add?
Sir, in the back?
Yes. The only buildings still there are the long car repair shed, the planing mill and pattern shop, the electrical shop, which is connected to the shed, and the locker room building, the storage and locker room building. When I first started looking at the shop in the 1990s, late 1990s, the paint shop was in a precarious position, but probably could have been restored. But it ultimately collapsed. It was a fascinating building. There's a little brick building at the north end of the shed that's still there as well. It was used by, what was the, Royce, what was the name of the company that you were involved with that worked in the shops right after it closed? Was it Railway Engineering Supply or something like that? Is that correct? Trying to remember. I don't recall. So at any rate, there was a company that rebuilt diesel locomotives in the old planing mill and pattern shop for some years after 1971, after the Western Railway of Alabama moved out. But that operation closed down too, and then it just went into decline. Did I answer your question? Well, that's hard to say. Around 2000, when we formed a group called Old Alabama Rails, and some of the folks here in this room were participating in trying to get a railway museum located in there. I think at this point the city would like to preserve those. There are different kinds of uses. I think the shed has been used for several gathering events. So I can't answer that question for you. I don't know, Lois, do you have? Did I pull the plug? No. Okay.
Well, for me, one of the great next things to bring closure to the film is that this is a model. Jeremiah, are you a doctor? Jeremiah has created a 3D model, and so you saw some of those images. He's able to mix the model with the film, but this model exists as a computer model, and so our goal is that going forward, that it would live, and that you would be able to, from a computer, look and explore and get detailed information about each building, about the architect if we have it, that you can go building by building. There were some scenes where you flew through, so you're going to be able to do that digitally. We're working right now with the county archives to try to have that there so it can be a resource for fourth graders as they learn more about Alabama. So for us, that's the big next step, is about this film, this information and the model that exists behind it, and how we can use it as a teaching tool to sort of honor all those workers and that were there for all those years. We do have some building information in the back table. We're also going to try to make all that public so you can look building by building and compare what's there today with what was there at that time. Yes, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Or we have two. Okay.
During World War I, the federal government required the railroads to do an inventory of everything the railroads owned, and some of the information I've gleaned from that will show section houses where the folks who actually worked on the track teams, at the back of the property, there were some section houses where both laborers and foremen lived on the north end of the property. Most of the shop's employees lived around town. The one guy, his name is Harry Taylor, said, "You know, a lot of fences in Montgomery and more than a few houses were built from lumber taken from the old wooden boxcars when they got rid of them, and on some of the fences you could still see the letters and numbers on the fence boards." So throughout the town there was right about where North Court Street crosses the interstate, maybe actually it would have been right where the interstate is today, sort of the main agent for the West Point route in Montgomery's house was, but that was torn down a long time ago. And that was owned by the railroad.
I think we have time for one more very important question.
How long was the water of the flood? I'm not sure. That flood that we saw in the picture was, I think, in the 1960s. And if you think where the river is, that means that flood went at least probably a quarter of a mile inland. And I think so it was a big flood, but it was. I've got pictures of guys standing in it, and it comes up above their knees. So it wasn't deep, but you can be sure that it messed up a lot of stuff in the shops.
Okay, I think we have one more. 6:30 is
One,
going to be
one
our
more,
cutoff.
one more. General passenger rail ceased and the creation of Amtrak occurred in 1971, in spring 1971. The all-passenger rail to Montgomery ceased at that point, and the Crescent, which became the Southern Crescent at that point, because the Southern Railway continued to do passenger service for a number of years. They rerouted the Crescent through Birmingham and Meridian, and that's still the route of the Crescent. But for most of its life, the Crescent came through from Atlanta, came through Montgomery, and went through Mobile and along the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. So, but Amtrak, what's your question about Amtrak? No, Amtrak was created as the National Railway Corporation when everybody else stopped passing it. It was consecutive, not simultaneous, except for a few railroads that did continue passenger service for a number of years, such as the Southern. But mostly it was, and there was some competition there, but it didn't last very long. We're done. Wonderful. Her husband was on the last ride.
That's actually a really good. We need to close the meeting, but we're going to stay after to talk. And I know you had some relatives that. Do you want to ask your question? I'm sorry, I don't want to. We are absolutely seeking experiences and oral histories from folks. We have a sign-in sheet for if you have memories that you want to share. We hope that this can be the start of gathering that and sort of getting the word out. And so you're helpful for that. And so Reverend Waldo and Jeremiah and his family are going to stay here for questions. We still got some popcorn left. And we look forward. We thank you for your time. I want to pass it back to Dr. Bailey to close out the Historic Preservation Commission meeting part of it, and we'll move to the more social part of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, how about a nice round of applause? This has been an excellent presentation tonight, and I just want to say that we have basically opened a whole new dimension in local history, and we need to pursue this a bit further. So I just want to say to those of you who might have a question that you might want to ask any of these persons who presented this afternoon, we're going to hang around for a few more minutes. Please do so. And if you have some additional questions tomorrow or next week, just call the City of Montgomery, the Development Division, and just ask those questions. But we want to continue the dialogue. We don't want this to be the last dimension to what we have here, because this was really super. I hope you enjoyed it, and let's continue our interest in local history. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for coming out, and we want to make certain that we have taken care of all of the water and the popcorn and everything else that we have available here this afternoon. Thank you very much.